Welcome to the Lorecast, where we look into the lore and the stories by which we live. I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist, and you can find us at chalquist.com/podcast and at a number of other online venues. This particular podcast is partly at the request of Catherine, who is asking about how parenting styles may or may not come down to us from how we were parented. Nothing direct, though. The question was in terms of, let's say you have a parent who was very permissive in their parenting. Does that make for perhaps a codependent parenting style? So I want to talk a little bit about that. And Catherine, thanks for suggesting this topic. It's a really good one. I'd like to go further with it too and talk about the hidden emotional legacies that get handed down to us through the family line, which is something that I often saw and studied when I practiced family therapy. And it's something that family therapists are familiar with, but most of the public is not. So it seemed like it would be a useful thing to talk about, and also include something about how do you detect that and how do you deal with it. So there's an old therapist joke that goes something like this. Where my mother was strict, or my father, where my mother was strict, I decided to be lenient with my kids. Where my mother was difficult, I decided to be easy. Where my mother was impatient, I decided to be patient. And what I've done is I've raised a child who's exactly like my mother. So the joke draws our attention to a dynamic we often see in families where one generation of parents is a certain way, they have a certain parenting style, and the next generation goes in the other direction, which makes sense when you think about it. I have not parented in the sense of having my own children. I've been a step parent. And I remember wrestling with this many years ago, back when I was married, because my parents were fairly strict about some things, and they were inconsistent and chaotic about others. And so when I got married, there were two kids in the family I married into, and what I tried not to do is be like my parents toward them, but I think I went to the opposite extreme. And there were times when I should have set limits that I didn't. And being in therapy helped to iron that out. And so I did better with kids in later relationships. But that's part of it. That's kind of the surface part of it, the conscious part of it. And we should look at what's below that too. So let's take the example of a very permissive parent who's kind of detached and unevolved and maybe inconsistent. So again, on the surface, that can lead you down the path of codependency. And so in your parenting style, you'll tend to be just the opposite because of your experience of what you went through previously. So where your parents might have been uninvolved, you might be over-involved, for instance, or where they were neglectful, you might be overly caretaking. It's a pretty common dynamic. And in terms specifically of codependency, for those of you who don't know, I actually have taught an entire class on this. It's online and it's available at the Young Platform. That's Jung, Young Platform. Class on managing codependency. What it is, how it shows up, dealing with it in our family, in our romantic relationships, at work, and what some of the underlying dynamics are. It's all in that class. So to go back to this example, so when there's a parent involved who is kind of detached and permissive, there's many different reasons for that sort of behavior in parents. So, we wouldn't want to say that's because of this, but to just mention some of the reasons. Sometimes parents are that way because they're confused. They don't really know how to parent. Nobody makes them go to parenting classes usually unless they do something that gets them arrested at some point. So there's not really a good set of instructions. We go by how we were parented and try to learn as best we can to be good parents ourselves. But sometimes too, there's a difficulty in that parent in terms of making attachments. Sometimes because of their own past and their own experience, they have trouble bonding with their own children. And it isn't that they necessarily dislike their kids or hate their kids or anything like that. It's that they're defended. Their capacity for love and affection is very guarded because of how severely they were injured. And that inevitably affects their parenting style if they don't get into some kind of healing for that. And so in their kids, it fills them with this feeling of being neglected and emotionally neglected, and sometimes guilt. Did I do something wrong? Does mom not like me? And all those things that kids wonder about. And it can make you needy. And the subtler message on an unconscious level is that emotional attachments are dangerous. And that's one of the reasons that this can show up as codependency, because codependency is a sort of substitute for honestly getting your needs met openly. It's a way of getting loved by not by asking for love or by being with available people or partners or friends, but codependency is a way of getting love through the back door by caretaking people, even to the point where it makes you miserable, or the people that you're caretaking push you away and say, you're suffocating me. It creates lots of problems on that level. One of which is a profound ambiguity about when to set limits and hold boundaries. So there was a family I saw years ago when I was still practicing as a family therapist intern, and they came into the room, sat down, and we talked a little bit, and the kids were there. And there was this one kid who just started systematically knocking things over and trying to destroy things in my office. And I immediately turned to the parents and I said, stop this behavior immediately or you're done. So by doing it that way, I was empowering them to actually be parents. And that's something I see a lot. In the past, I saw a lot of overly strict parents, maybe like mine were, maybe a generational thing, where the poor kids can hardly breathe. You know, there's regulations and rules about everything. And for a while anyway, I'm not in practice anymore, but a lot of the parents I saw were very confused about how to set limits. And they felt like they were somehow being mean to their kids by insisting that they not do certain things and having consequences for misbehavior. And that sort of confusion about parenting and limits often comes from one of two things, either overly strict parents or overly permissive parents. And the kids who are subjected to it usually will act out more and more until somebody sets a limit on what they're doing. Because on the inside, they're scared to be able to get away with all that. There's no adult showing up saying, no, you can't do this. So all of this really points to a wider set of dynamics that I often see in families and see it in my own families too, adoptive and birth. And it has to do with emotional legacies. And this in turn links up with something that Bazarmeni Nagy, who was at one time a pretty well-known family therapist from Hungary, and he had this idea, or rather an observation, about what he called family ledgers, where we each keep this kind of unconscious list of emotional obligations that get handed down through the family, and sometimes they're invisible. So 3 generations, 4 generations back, you may have had parents who just give up all of their dreams and all of their desires to focus on providing for their family. Maybe there's something economically going on in the culture at that time, requires huge sacrifice, and maybe something else. And so that gets transmitted to their kids, who transmit it at an unconscious level to their kids. And so there's this expectation in the family ledger that you have to sacrifice everything for family, and it rolls down the generations and becomes invisible. And unless somebody does research on it, they don't know where it comes from. And so you find yourself unconsciously just putting your happiness on hold and maybe not going back to school, maybe having to give up a job that would really be great for you and stuff like that, or even giving up relationships because the ledger says that that's what you have to do. To go against that, that set of covert rules feels like disloyalty to the family, and it creates an enormous amount of guilt. So people outside the system often can't understand that, and well, why don't you just go to college, and that kind of response, right? But you've got maybe 100 years, maybe more of emotional history in the family that says otherwise. And of course, the difficulty with these kinds of family dynamics is not just that they're unconscious, but also that once you do become aware of them and you have the fantasy that you can simply break free and do something else, then you tend to unconsciously recreate the ledger in the next generation. And there can be family ledgers, and we could call them different things like covert sets of rules, family rules, or family obligations, family loyalties, family debts, right? Emotional debts that have never been repaid. These are persistent, and they can be about all kinds of things. Like some families have this rule: you have to keep your head down or you'll lose it, because they came out of situations of oppression where that was an actual survival rule. Or there may be a family rule that says never trust outsiders, only trust family. There's lots of other examples, but what family therapy training sometimes tells us is we need to look at how family members act in certain situations when it seems like they're being compelled to do something against their best interest. That usually is the sign of a hidden family obligation, rule, ledger, whatever you want to call it. And so the task then, whether you're in family therapy or you're just exploring this on your own, is to ask yourself, what are these obligations that I'm still dancing to like a puppet? What are these rules that have come down through the generations that I still stick to? And it's good to ask friends and loved ones these questions as well, because when you're in it, it's hard to see it, and you might be just doing it automatically. It tends to get internalized as this is just how things are. So once you become aware of what these strings are, these obligations, these covert rules, then you're in a position to change the story, which is something I do with my lorology work. If you go to chalkwist.com and look at the blogs, I have some blogs on lorology and what that is. It's about detecting and redesigning deep stories so that we can have more expansive lives instead of dancing to these invisible forces. And so once you know about the ledger or the obligation, then you have the choice to widen the story. And what I always recommend doing, and I recommended this to my clients, is that they not immediately try to get out of the story or the obligation or just push it away with force, but that they recognize the lesson in it and how it served the family at some point, and how it can be perhaps not given up on all the way, but it can be changed. It can be met in a different way. And some people create rituals around this, and they, have an imaginary or as we prefer to say, imaginal discussion with their ancestors. This is a good time to do work on what they went through, by the way, your ancestors, to the degree that you can find out. And then, call them up in imagination and then say some version of, I know why you made these sacrifices and why you did these things. And they're important and they mattered at the time. And I'm going to go in Another way of saying this is that we're telling different stories about leadership here. The loyalty to the family is important. Being able to put one's needs on hold, that's important too in certain circumstances. But sometimes it actually doesn't serve the family. And I'm thinking of examples where There's been a few families I've known where the rule is that the women, and this is common in patriarchy, the women have to be the sacrificers, the main sacrificers, and have to give up school or a really lucrative job because the women before them did that. And so it creates that hidden debt, that hidden obligation. And so I've seen people sometimes do a ritual around that and thank those women in the past for their sacrifice and actually invite them as internal presences. You know, can you accompany me to my first day of school or my first day on the job? I want you to be there with me. And it's surprising how powerful this can be when you do it. The family therapist Virginia Satir pioneered a technique that she called family sculpting, where you get a group of people together and they all play members of the family. And you can do this with ancestors too. This was taken over by something that's now called family constellation work, and so it can be in that form as well. I think a key part of this, and I think this is especially true in hyper individualistic cultures like mine, is to not harbor the fantasy that you can simply escape from the web of obligation. You'll just recreate it. Can't tell you how many times I've seen this, and I have done it myself as well. There has to be some kind of a process of not only uncovering and exploring, but of actually facing towards these people, whether they were your parents or your grandparents or somebody further back, and having some kind of a conversation with them. It doesn't matter if they're still around. And, writing letters to them or diary entries or whatever it is, or talking to a therapist about it can be helpful. But having some kind of a process where you show relationally that you really get what the ledger was about or the obligations, and you really, to some extent, value the psychologies that they came out of. And that now that you have done all that, it's time to go in a different direction. And there's a film that deals beautifully with what this can look like. It's called The Real Dirt on Farmer John. And the film's about how a young farmer named John Peterson inherited his dad's farm, who got it from his dad. And the farming methods that were being used back then were monocropping that actually injured the soil. And in the film, you can see how what happens to the land also shows up as a certain amount of emotional damage in its human occupants, including John himself. And rather than turn his back on the whole thing, which he tries to do at one point unsuccessfully, he realizes that's what's needed is for him not to simply not be a farmer anymore and abandon the whole family legacy, but to engage in a different kind of farming that actually feeds the land and feeds the people who eat his food, and have a relationship, a whole network of relationships directly with those people, instead of doing it in terms of you farm food, you sell it to somebody who gives it to a grocery store and all that. So the film shows him making that difficult transition, and it's a great series of images and symbols for how to do that kind of work. There's also a useful term that comes from psychoanalysis, and it refers to turning ghosts into ancestors. Ghosts into ancestors. I really like that image. And I've found through my own experience and seeing other people do this kind of transformational work that when you redesign the story, it not only pays homage to the people who came before you, but it allows you to go in a different direction. And that too has transformative effects, not only on your own family, but also on all of your pattern of relationships, and ultimately your view of yourself as well. Thank you.